Okay, we're now going to open it up to questions, and then we'll leave time at the end for Abhijit to respond, and Angus to re-respond. So please go ahead.
Francisco Bozano, again, tenure ecology. I have 3 questions. The first one is for, well, they're all for both of you. Don't you both agree that one thing is the technique of, in any field of statistics, and the other thing is the science, and that what you're basically disagreeing with is if the relationship with the science, the principles on which it should be applied, it has not been correctly considered. But wouldn't it be true that you both agree that this is necessary? Because I don't see the disagreement. There's a disagreement in terms of how you depict one another's examples, but I think you're both looking for a relationship between the ideas that one develops through trial and error and the technique. So perhaps the dichotomy and the distance isn't as great. The other thing I wanted to ask is, can all phenomena be explained statistically? Is everything stochastically significant? Because the whole idea of sustainable development is that it is not. That we've gotten to a reach of complexity because of the ecological and the economic and the financial crisis, that one needs to have the human beings not just to be tested, but as participants, as having a voice and regaining their voice and telling us here, playing the expert game, what things are really about. So isn't there something beyond the statistic discussion? And the last one is, I'm surprised about the dichotomy that has been established by the previous speaker between trade and aid. There's been a very long struggle in the world to get...
I'm sorry, this is not the session to comment on that. We're commenting on this,
I want to ask the speakers, because there has been a mention today.
We have a lot of people waiting, so
yeah,
I have
this
to
is
cut
my,
you off.
my last question. Is there really a dichotomy between aid and trade? Is there a dichotomy?
Okay, next.
My question is to Abhijit about the specific microcredit example. I view myself as a fairly dumb person when I live my life. So when somebody gives me money, at this particular point, the way I would think about my life is, how will I use this money to do what I want to do? And very few people plan too much into the future. So how does that momentary decision making affect the whole notion of results that you guys collect with respect to microcredit and so on? Thanks.
For those of us who work at organizations that work in development, I guess there's been a lot of talk about trial and error as opposed to sort of more rigorously constructed trials. But you know, if there's moments where trial and error doesn't seem to work, if you have 10 elements of your intervention and you want to experiment on one, do you see that as something that should be the province of organizations themselves, or do you think for the most part people at organizations lack the statistical training, the academic background to be attempting to do sort of anything beyond simple trial and error and experimenting on their own projects?
Okay, next. By the way, to keep within the time, the people who are now already in line, you can ask questions, but please no new additions to the lines. Yeah.
So having been an RA on a few RCTs and microcredit, I've found that there seems to be sort of a disconnect between what we would like to experiment with and sort of incentives of loan officers in the bank. And maybe like you might work with the head of a bank who's very excited about experimenting with a particular repayment schedule or size of a loan, but for the sort of reputations of loan officers on the ground, it becomes almost impossible. And I was wondering if there's a way to sort of allow these experiments to go forward and still sort of keep the stability of our partners around.
Hi, good afternoon. I guess my question specifically is regarding to the beneficiaries of the aid, the RCTs, or the parent population. I am representing the Teso North Development Forum, the location where the school uniform randomized control trial was implemented, and also the fertilizer RCT was also implemented by IPA. And I had an opportunity to speak to some of the local people there, specifically in agriculture, and they had no recollection of many of the randomized control trials that were implemented by IPA. So my question is, how, as testers, do you share, or how do you specifically share the information, the successes and the failures of these randomized control projects to the parent population? And can you give any specific examples of sharing any of these, the results of these RCTs? Thank you.
Listening to both of you present and this whole day, I'm not convinced in any way that RCTs and TNEs are not mutually, or are mutually exclusive. It doesn't, it seems that the problems that you were presenting with RCTs are fixable by allowing more perfect information, allowing people to really see what was done. If the problem is an outlier, that's an easy fix. Just look at the data, where did it come from? And it's easy to find an outlier in there. It's less easy than you think. Okay, fine. That's fine, but I'm just saying I think that there's an option for compatibility in these, and the ways these are used, and not just in extending the word rigorous to RCTs versus other type of TNEs. That's a problem endemic in economics literature. There's all sorts of papers that just say, oh, we had a movement, positive or negative, but they don't talk about significance or magnitude. So that's something that economists need to address in general. And also, what ways do you think that that can extend to other disciplines? Because we're talking about what is considered rigorous within economics, but what is considered rigorous in terms of the human rights discipline or anthropology or sociology? Like, what other ways can we view positive and negative changes in development discipline?
Thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. They were quite entertaining. My question is as follows. In your discussion of evaluative methods, can you address more explicitly the way that systems are approached, especially those that include behavioral components or perception of risk components, and address in particular qualitative data? I guess that dovetails nicely with the young woman's question, qualitative data and how it can complement or supplement more traditional methods of data collection and analysis.
Hi, I raised this question in an earlier panel because due to time constraints it went unanswered. So I'd like to ask Professor Banerjee, given that in a randomized control trial you're randomizing groups of people to not get this desired treatment or what you think is the desired treatment, and that post-treatment outcomes take a long time to measure, and this group of people are randomly selected not to have this intervention for that period of time, to what extent in your experience does this ethical issue come into play, and how does that affect like the implementability of an RCT and your interaction with the people who experience it?
This question is for Angus. As far as the use for entrepreneurs of trial and error, A/B testing, and RCTs, how should RCTs be used, when should they be used, and how should they be integrated into developing programs? Thank you.
Last question.
Absolutely. As stated earlier, stellar panel. The resumes back up everything. Thank you for your time. With regard to RCTs, and how do you think you can incorporate the practical applications of regional development banks like the IABD, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, et cetera? Thank you.
Okay, Abhijit? So let's decide on the time. How much time do you think you need? We have no time. We have no time, but I want to give you a chance to respond.
So let me respond to a few of the questions and say something about what Angus was saying. Let me take 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes for each of you? Sure. Okay.
Maybe slightly less.
Okay.
Let me start with Angus. I mean, I guess
I think it'll be louder. I think if all economists were as smart as Angus, maybe what he describes would indeed be a coherent agenda. I think the problem is the rest of us are not. And therefore, I think it's very important to, I think the notion, the notion that somehow that we should just judge the evidence by its quality has to be right, but who's going to do the judging? And I think that all fields establish kind of ground rules for what is considered to be evidence, and we always do it imperfectly, and sometimes we make grandiose claims about them which are not exactly true. But I don't think the absence of ground rules makes methodological sense in any field. And I think the idea of an RCT has the advantage of making you think very hard about causality. Sometimes, I don't even think that you necessarily need to do an RCT to benefit from an RCT. You often benefit just because it made you think about, look, what are the things, what are the potential confounds? I think one of the great advantages of the culture that RCTs have created is that people now, even the ones who don't do RCTs, think very hard, like Angus always has, and therefore this is why I think he personally feels a little bit affronted by this process because it seems to include him in it. He's always thought very rigorously about everything that any piece of evidence is looked at, but the rest of us are not inclined to do so. I think formal procedures for looking at evidence are useful precisely because they kind of force us to confront many things that we don't usually, just because we're not as smart as Angus, we don't actually confront. The second point that Angus was making, I find even more troubling. I think there is some implicit notion of this trial and error being somehow some implicit process of theorizing, which we can do as long as we don't sort of somehow get down on the ground and start calling them, become too pompous actually, and start calling them RCTs. There's some process by which we can just somehow go from one piece of knowledge to another. It's like playing Angry Birds. I mean, if you actually try to have a policy, work with somebody implementing a policy, which both Angus and I have, I actually don't think that the metaphor of Angry Birds is at all helpful. I think it's not helpful precisely because, in a sense, each course correction that's going to happen creates so much rigidity. So after starting the whole conversation by saying that we ignore politics in the book, which we don't, maybe we get it wrong, but we certainly don't ignore it, I think thinking about the process by which knowledge creation gets managed and, and absorbed into organizations, especially governmental organizations, in this particularly sort of naive way seems odd to me. That that there's some way in which we within the government are going to sort of be intelligently theorize what we see. We make a move here, it doesn't work, we move there. We don't actually have to organize the process of knowledge production. We don't have to externalize it. What RCTs do beautifully is they often externalize the knowledge. We lose control over them. And the idea that within government that this knowledge creation process will be done in a way that will be intelligent and sensitive to all the causality issues, and therefore we're going to just go straight to that perfect parabola that's going to kill the pig. It just seems to me to be, in a sense, deeply against what Angus started by saying, which is that we need to think about the politics of all these things. I think it's precisely because I personally worry a lot about both the politics of knowledge and the process more generally of knowledge creation within organizations and within the economics profession that I feel that RCTs have served an enormously valuable purpose. And related to that is this idea that somehow it's we can theorize our way. I mean, in a sense, what are you doing when you're playing Angry Birds? You're creating a theory. You're constantly sort of looking at this, and you're saying, well, this one doesn't work, it falls too short. That's a theory. Then you take, so therefore I should put it a little more flatter, and then it's going to go and hit the pig. And that's another theory, and then it fails because something else has you've forgotten. Now, this process of theorizing, I think, it's extremely important that we make the process explicit, because that's the way both by which we get more people into it, make it more democratic, and also because that's what gives us access to a whole range of interesting ideas. Otherwise, it's going to be some, either Angus will do it and maybe it'll come out right, or the rest of us will do it and it's just going to come out wrong all the time. So that I'm out of time, so I can't answer any of the other questions.
Okay, Angus.
Yeah, I mean, as always with Abhijit, I agree with everything he says, and I find him utterly charming, but utterly unsound at the same time. And, and the line that, people are too stupid to do anything except randomized controlled trials, I think is sort of deeply patronizing. And he only made it palatable by including himself among the stupid people. I've been in rooms when other people made the argument that, only graduates, it's the only thing that graduate students are capable of doing. And, if you say that, you immediately lose the audience, and Abhijit is much too clever to do that. But this process let's start from something I just agreed with, which is when you're playing Angry Birds, you're developing theories as you go. And the theories are being shaded all the time. And quite often you realize that the theory you've been working on is completely wrong, and you have to find a whole new means of attack that sometimes fails altogether. But you're developing theories, you're understanding, and I think it's a very good metaphor for the way we learn things. And my argument about RCTs is RCTs can't get you there because the dimensionality problem. It just can't be done. I mean, you could prove that mathematically. But let me just say one thing, and it came up in several of the comments too. I don't regard RCTs as mutually exclusive from other ways of doing it. I don't think they're necessarily, you have to do one or you have to do the other. In fact, that's the position that I'm really opposing. And that's the one message I think I want to leave you with, which is what I'm really upset about, and I think is really terrible and it will do us enormous harm, is this idea that this evidence is good evidence simply because it's an RCT. And therefore that the RCT is protected from the standards. It's been sacralized, if you like. I mean, it's become a sort of holy object, which we must take on faith, and we're not allowed to inquire into it. No matter how small the sample size, no matter how badly it was executed, no matter how many people didn't accept their assignment and crossed over, no matter how many schools were struck by lightning halfway through the randomized controlled trial, there's all sorts of things that go wrong with randomized controlled trials. Sometimes the samples are very small. Often the people who are calculating the standard errors are not doing it correctly. So all the scrutiny that has been traditionally brought to bear on all the applied econometric papers that I and everybody else have ever written must be brought to RCTs too. If I can get people to do that and stop saying things like, but if we can't do an RCT, what should we do? That's the crazy question, because you should be saying, what should we do? And an RCT might or might not be the right answer to that. And when you've got an RCT, you can't simply say, take this to the government and say, this is solid because it's an RCT. I mean, that's a terrible thing to do, because you're putting in the bad evidence along with the good. There are bad RCTs as well as good RCTs. So that's the only thing. Let's take the halo off the RCT and recognize it for, the human thing that it is, with all the possible flaws. We can't treat these differently from other forms of evidence. That's all. That's the one most important thing I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think this conference delivered on its title, which was Debates in Development. Thanks to both sides here on this panel and to all sides of all the other panels. I guess one closing thought I'll leave you with is that a lot of people viewing debates like this or viewing other debates that I've been involved in and other development people have been involved in, they always say, why can't you guys just get along and agree and not be so mean to each other? But actually, you know, just like sort of in our trial by jury system, the truth emerges by the prosecutor and the defense attorney just arguing each other blind up and down, and then, you know, you take out of that process of argumentation, you get closer to the truth. And I think that is exactly the scientific process, and it's exactly the standard that we should have in development, just as we do in all the other fields where we fiercely argue over what is the right thing to do in economics. And I'm very proud of all of our speakers today for fulfilling that scientific mandate to fiercely debate, to advance the truth in a very honorable and distinguished way. Thank you very much.